Okay, so this week, Engerman and Sokoloff is the paper we'll be looking at. It's looking at the colonial origins of institutions and how those matter for growth. It is a classic of the economic history genre. I love the paper. When I first read it in grad school, I floored by it. But even in that class, in my grad school class, when I learned about it, it was even, I think more transformative for students in that class from Latin America. And I remember specifically one woman from Jamaica just like absolutely freaking out over the paper. That being said, the paper is not without its critics. You can certainly find critics of this paper and kind of the institutional approach to growth, which is kind of kind of the main text in kind of the institutional theory for growth is Why Nations Fail by Asimoglu and Johnson. And so, you can find critiques of that work and this if you're not buying what I am selling in this lecture. So Engerman and Sokoloff, this paper is really thinking about this mystery that your poor colonies, your backwater colonies, become the richest countries. So, from the 1700s to the 1900s, there is this reversal where your backwater colonies become your richest countries in the world. This even kind of happens within Europe too. Your big colonial players, Spain and Portugal. Those are the countries that are initially have the most wealth generating colonies. You have your Spanish treasure ships being sent back to Spain, gold just flowing into Spain. These are the global powers of the 16 and 1700s. I mean, famously, Spain and Portugal meet with the Pope and divide the world. They say, okay, this half of the world is Portugal's, this half is Spain's. So these were, really the dominant colonial powers. They are completely supplanted by Britain in the 1800s. Britain becomes the global superpower, the richest country, and then later, Germany and kind of just to a lesser extent, France and Spain and Portugal become, relative to other Western European countries, become poor, and or poor, not poor, but like not on the same level. Even in the 20th century, you see Portugal and Spain lagging very far behind, particularly Portugal. I mean, even now, Portugal is very much not as wealthy as the rest of Europe in many metrics. Not just income per capita, things like literacy, educational rates, um, really lag behind. So you have this reversal where these places that were backwaters become very wealthy. Now the answer is once the economy switches from zero sum, from this Malthusian world to a world of innovation, dynamism, and growth, that's when these other places take off. That's when your US's, your Australia's, your Singapore's, your Japan, that's when these places really take off. And so the answer, according to Engerman and Sokoloff, lies in the institutions. That these institutions that were put in place when these places were backwaters become very conducive to growth once we start to get sustained innovation, the sustained innovation that the Industrial Revolution brings. Okay, so here we have this mystery right here. Oops, let me get my pen out. Here we go. So this is what up here, this is what Angerman and Sokoloff are talking about. These places that are relative backwaters in 1500, you could fast forward this to 1700 as well. These are really kind of poor places become very wealthy, by the time we get to the 20th century. So when we're going back in time like this, we have to put our like data detective hats on and figure out how are we going to tell which countries or which areas are wealthy versus other areas, or doing well versus other areas. How can we tell what the standard of living is when we go back in time? So one way to do it is to use height data, is to use, okay, how tall are people? Because this will be a function of nutrition. So that's one thing that people do. You have some data detectives actually like digging up skeletons, throughout the world and measuring the skeletons. It's a good work if you can get it. Um, there are other ways to do it. One way is population density. your agriculture has to be very productive to have cities, to have densely populated cities. It means your agricultural sector has to be productive because you're feeding the people in the cities. The people in the cities are not working on farms. So we can look at population density as a proxy for development when we go further back in time. And so that's what Osamoglou, Johnson, and Robinson are doing here. So what they're showing is these places that are relatively not populated are become the richest place once we fast forward. All right. We can zoom in on the US, and the same thing happens even within the US, the regions in the US. The initial wealthy parts of the US become the poorer parts, by the 19th century, by the middle of the 1800s. Um, and this is how I think about U.S. history: is the South and the North are essentially separate countries. They have they're very different origins in terms of like the economic activity in these places, and they have very different trajectories going forward. Um, and I think of them as like almost two separate places. Um, Even up until, I mean, you can see some extent to the present. In terms of being, the type of institutions and the type of opportunity afforded to the people that live in these different regions. And you even see this by where immigrants choose to go when they come to the U.S. Very few go to the South, implicitly knowing there's like little opportunity for mobility, income mobility in the South. So these differences you even see up to the present. All right, and so when you look at the South is the wealthy colony in terms of the free population. That the free population is much richer in the South than it is in the North initially. Exports are dominated by the South initially as well. The North is much poorer relative to the South. But by the time we get to the Civil War, everything's going on in the North. There's more population. There's all the manufacturing's in the North. The North has surpassed the South in exports, even though the South, supposedly cotton is king, supposedly cotton, rules the world. The North has actually exported more. This is primarily manufactured goods. Merchants, all in the North. Railroad infrastructure, all in the North. Grain, all in the North. Farms, even by farms, this is small scale farms, surpassing what's in the South. Iron, again, all of your industry, your finance this is all centered in the North. You read about the Civil War, the North, and very much during the Civil War, even though it's even losing initially, it's going about its business. Like there's rowing competitions in Harvard. They're building the railroads still up through New York. Your finances, your robber barons of the day are still going about their business, building their empires. You know, the North economy is chugging along even during the Civil War. And so there's a reversal where it's initially a backwater. The North is a backwater, in the 1700s. Um, but by the middle of the 1800s, it is really the center of the U.S. economy is in the North, and this is one of the reasons why the North kind of easily defeats the South in the Civil War. I mean, it had a leadership what's the word I'm looking for? Disadvantage. Initially the northern generals just were not very I don't know, good. Good. They were not the tacticians that the southern generals were, but in every other way the North had the advantage in terms of resources by the time of the Civil War, and ultimately were able to defeat the South. Okay, and so Ingram and Sokoloff, are essentially going to point to the institutions. They are really going to say the reason these areas grew rich is they inherited certain institutions from their colonial era, from their colonial days, and those institutions were a product of the initial endowments. What type of colony was this place? Was it a settler colony, or was it a colony based around extraction, based around wealth generation for a thin group of not thin physically, thin, and there weren't that many, group of elites? That is going to be their explanation. Let's take a break there.